I remember when I was in Cleveland, I knew a lot of like older communists. And there was one particular fellow, but I mean, he wasn't the only one. I met a couple, and they would always talk about the author of this book. This is Working Class USA, The Power and the Movement by Gus Hall. And Gus Hall from Ohio, from Niles, Ohio, which is a suburb of Youngstown, Gus Hall was the leader of the Communist Party USA in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. He was kind of the face of American communism during the Cold War. Gus Hall, right? He was after William Z. Foster. William Z. Foster was the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Gus Hall was later. When this older guy that I knew would talk about him, sometimes he would start crying. He'd grown up in the Communist Party in the 50s during the witch hunts, was when he was a kid. And he referred to Gus Hall as Uncle Gus. He said, my Uncle Gus, my Uncle Gus. And he would talk about his Uncle Gus, and he would tell us stories about and they were not blood relatives at all, mind you. But he would talk about kind of the legend of Gus Hall. And when you listened to this older guy talk about the legend of Gus Hall, about his Uncle Gus, you got an understanding of the reason that Gus Hall was so loved was because he reminded people of the 1930s. I mean, Gus Hall was a young man during the 1930s. He was actually imprisoned at one point. He was a steel worker in Youngstown, Ohio during the late 1930s. And very famously, during the Little Steel Strike of 1939, Gus Hall and the United Steelworkers Union had set up a picket line in front of this steel plant there in Youngstown, Ohio. They weren't letting any scab workers into the plant, and it was tough. So then they started flying the scabs over the picket line with airplanes. Right? So that's how intense it was. The company, in order to keep making steel as these workers are out there on the picket line, not letting anyone cross, right? Militant steel workers. As that's happening, lo and behold, the company starts flying replacement workers in with airplanes. So Gus Hall, and he brags about it. I mean, he didn't do it himself, but he talks about it, and he talks about it in this book, Working Class USA. Gus Hall and a few of their union buddies, they ended up shooting down an airplane. Right? Shooting down an airplane. They took hunting rifles, and they shot down airplanes. You can read about this. Look it up. It happened in Youngstown, Ohio. Steelworkers shot down airplanes in order to win their union rights. That's heavy. Right? That's some history you're not going to get in school, but it happened, right? And the class struggle in the United States is very militant. Gus Hall went to jail. He had a prison sentence at one point because he and some other people, they were accused of apparently that there was a bridge that replacement scabs were being driven over, and they were talking about destroying this bridge. Allegedly, they were discussing it. Right, that's how militant the labor unions were back in the late 1930s. There was this level of militancy. And organized labor that was very extreme. These people were fighting for their livelihoods and their jobs, and they weren't afraid to get rough, right? The company brought in the National Guard to shoot them down. They had company thugs who assassinated workers. Well, they were tough, right? And Gus Hall reminded people of that kind of militancy, and that was Gus Hall. He was fired eventually during the 1950s. He couldn't be a steel worker anymore, so he worked at a gas station in Niles, Ohio. He was a gas station attendant. But every week, when he was a gas station attendant, as the leader of the Communist Party of Ohio, Gus Hall would give a weekly radio address, right? They would buy time on a statewide radio station, and they would say, "We are now bringing you a message from paid message from Gus Hall, the leader of the Communist Party of Ohio." And Gus Hall would make a radio speech that they paid for out of their dues money every Saturday, right? And eventually Gus Hall was put in federal prison for being a communist. I mean, it's kind of an amazing story. And, Gus Hall, you can watch some interviews with him in the 80s, some of his presidential campaigns after he got out of prison. And people will say he wasn't the best, orator out there, but he'd been through it. I mean, and he went to federal prison for a long time. And he was a tough militant. He was a union militant, and he reminded people of the 1930s. And when I knew these older communists in Cleveland, they would talk about him like they were talking about, like Dr. Martin Luther King or something. They would say, Uncle Gus, Uncle Gus. And they held him kind of in reverence because they understood this was a man who'd fought for their lives and fought for their communities. I mean, if you read about the stuff that people went through back in those days, it's pretty intense. For example, Henry Winston was an African American man who was a leader of the Communist Party USA, along with Gus Hall. He was on the national board, and he went to federal prison at the time in the late 1948 when they were sending all the communist leaders to prison. And in prison, they didn't give him adequate food. And as a result, he ended up with improper food, with not getting the medical treatment he needed. He ended up losing his eyesight. He went blind, right? Henry Winston went blind in federal prison. He was in federal prison for being a communist. He was in there for 4 or 5 years, but they took his eyesight from him. Just a horrendous thing. I mean, if you think about the sacrifices that the Communist Party USA went through, and the people that maintained that organization, it goes to show you, during the late 1930s, right? The second term of President Roosevelt up until the end of World War II, being a communist in the USA wasn't a big deal. Right? I mean, I've referred to the Roosevelt administration as being far left, and I stand by that. They were far left. They were bad in a lot of ways, but for their time, and even for today, in terms of economics, they were far left. They were a far left administration, probably the most left-wing presidency we've had in the last 100 years, probably, right? And the Communist Party USA was part of the Roosevelt movement. And, a lot of people were aligned with the Communist Party. If you want to get a sense of that, you should watch some Hollywood movies. Right? You can see how powerful the Communist Party USA was by watching some old movies. Watch the movie The North Star by Lillian Hellman, right? It was a Hollywood movie, The North Star. It's a musical. A Hollywood musical written by Lillian Hellman, card-carrying member of the Communist Party. In fact, she was a Broadway playwright and wrote the first play ever championing gay rights. Her name, it was called The Children's Hour. But she wrote this movie. She wrote the screenplay for this movie called The North Star. And this was a Hollywood movie, a straight-up Hollywood movie, 1942. It is communist propaganda, if there ever was any such a thing. I mean, you watch it, right? It's about a village in Ukraine. The Nazis invade, and they go and fight for their village, and it's kind of hokey. The first 15, 20 minutes of it are kind of like, what is this? Am I watching like a Soviet version of Leave It to Beaver or something? But once the Nazis invade, that movie gets very, very exciting. And it's this Ukrainian village, and they're forming underground militias, and they're resisting, and they're playing the Internationale, and the hero is a doctor who's got a Stalin mustache, and I mean, it's not subtle at all. It's a great movie. It's fun to watch. Like I said, the first 15, 20 minutes are a little bit hokey, but after that, it's pretty exciting. Watch, for example, the Battle of Russia. Now, the U.S. Armed Forces made a series of movies called Why We Fight during the Second World War. It was shown to all the members of the armed services to explain why they were fighting. Watch the one that they made called The Battle of Russia, right? It's quite exciting. I mean, watch Mission to Moscow. If you ever get a chance, watch Mission to Moscow. That's a great movie as well. And you'll get a feeling for how popular and how widely accepted the Communist Party USA was. I mean, these were mainstream movies that were shown in movie theaters all across the country. And they were basically pro-communist movies, right? In Hollywood, on Broadway, on university campuses. Joining the Communist Party meant you were against fascism, meant you thought the Soviet Union was exciting, was doing good things, meant you were pro-Roosevelt. It wasn't that big of a deal. When 1946 happened, when the Cold War began, all the people that thought being a communist wasn't a big deal and had joined because it was something trendy, they were out of there, right? They were out of there, right? And the Communist Party, those who stayed in it, they were the ones that really believed in it, right? They were the ones who went to federal prison. They were the ones who went into hiding and hid their names. I mean, you can read some of these memoirs. I mean, it's powerful stuff. I mean, the people who stayed in the Communist Party, those folks were serious. And that's why Gus Hall, who got out of federal prison, spent longer than federal prison than any of the other ones because he tried to flee to Mexico. Gus Hall got out of federal prison, and to these people, he was like a saint. He was Uncle Gus. They tell the story of when Gus Hall got out of prison, and he was out of prison, and he was walking around, going around the country speaking on one of his election campaigns. Somebody came up to him, an old friend, and they were in tears, and they said, Gus, I burned my party card. I got scared. I didn't want to go to jail. I burned my party card. I stopped being loyal to the party. And I feel ashamed of it. And Uncle Gus, as I was told in this anecdote, hugged him and said, it's okay. You did what you could do. I did what I could do, but we're both comrades. Stories like that you would hear from these older communists. It was almost like he represented what they had made all those sacrifices for, right? Gus Hall was the kind of incarnation of what they had stayed true to. And he was somebody who had been a militant, built the steelworkers union in the 1930s, and he was something to be reckoned with. And he was kind of sacred to them. Talk about U.S. history and all of that. The communists had summer camps back in the day. Camp Wochika, which stood for Worker Children's Camp. Camp Wochika in upstate New York, where communists would send their kids from all over the country. And the Young Pioneers Club for junior high school students. And, there was a whole history of that.